everyone, and welcome to our 14th session. It has been over a year, and we're having our 14th live podcast. I'm Dr. Shawnee Hardware, and with me this evening are Dr. Annette Walker, my very good friend, Mrs. Fiona Lloyd Henry, who is a PhD student at the University of Toronto, as well as Jerome Shepherd, who is providing tech support. Jerome, if you can show yourself to the people. We also have our esteemed panelists who I will be introducing very shortly. And they will be discussing the topic of assistive technology, essential for some and good for all. But before I introduce the panelists, we would like to thank members of our viewing audience here on Zoom, on YouTube, and on Facebook, where we're streaming live. And you might be wondering why this topic when there's so many issues happening in the Jamaican landscape, as well as Canadian educational system, because we do have guests here from Canada, and I'm sure guests listening elsewhere. So for the past 2 years, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been numerous issues around access to technologies. However, there has been definite silence around access to equity of access to technologies for students with disabilities. And we're using the term disabilities here, despite the popularity of it being called students with disabilities being termed as students with special needs in Jamaica, in line with the critical disability studies. So at times when referring to policies in Jamaica, we might use them interchangeable, but just recognize that we're being purposeful. Before we start the conversation, though, I do want to introduce our panelists. We have returning with us Ayodele Pompey. He was a panelist in our last session, the 13th session. He's a co-founder and executive, the CEO of Smart Term Limited. Ayodele has helped to scale the company tenfold in the past 18 months. He's responsible for deploying educational technology to over 600 schools in the US, Canada, and Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, and 8 other countries, amassing millions of assessments. He's a member of the board of directors for the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunications Authority, establishing rules and procedures in a regulatory environment for the authority's directorate. With us, we also have former Senator Dr. Floyd Morris, who is elected to the UN Committee for People with Disabilities, a lecturer at UWI, as well as a director for the Center of Disability Studies at the University of West Indies. He has authored 2 books pertaining to disability rights, which was the central message in his PhD dissertation as well. He's an ardent Seventh-day Adventist, and Fiona would like me to say that he is her oldest friend. So I don't know if oldest means closest. We'll leave that for Fiona to comment on, but she said I should always say that because that will make him chuckle. And then we have Jeff Hall. He's the vice principal at the Peel District School Board in Ontario, Canada. He is a PhD student in disability studies at OIZ at the University of Toronto and lives in Brampton, Ontario. Finally, we have Paul Golin, Professor Paul Golin, who is a professor of information system, former dean of the College of Business Management, and former head of the School of Computing and Information Technology at UTech, Jamaica. He's an academic, an inventor, consultant, guest columnist, and I have read some of your articles, Professor, author and philanthropist. And he was just sharing that he was doing a book launch, but I'll leave that for him to mention more on that. Professor Golin is a multiple winner of numerous awards from UTech, including awards of excellence in research. He won that twice. I wonder if it's consecutive years. Community service, won that twice as well, teaching and innovation. He's the author of the 21st century, the first 21 years of the 21st observation. Sorry, I'm butchering the title, and I promise I did read this before I came on. So let me try that again. He's the author of the first 21 years of the 21st century observation from Jamaica. I think I got it right on the second try. Currently, Professor Golin has been teaching cases on Jamaican companies for use locally and internationally. Okay, so now that we have introduced our panelists, I will hand it over to Dr. Walker to get us started.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hardware. All right, so to begin, let's get into it. We're so happy that you're able to join us again to repeat what Dr. Hardware said. But to our esteemed panelists this evening, we'd like for you to just share with our viewers what are assistive technologies. And I mean, let's start with Dr. Floyd Morris.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. And it's my pleasure to be here to participate in this very special discussion. And just to say that, you know, being Fiona's oldest friend doesn't mean that I am old.
Well, thank you for clarifying for that. We were wondering.
But assistive, when we speak of assistive technology, we're talking about any device, any equipment, any instrument that assists an individual to function more effectively in society on a day-to-day basis. And generally, assistive technologies are used by persons with disabilities to increase their functionability in society. So an example of assistive technology can be a wheelchair. It can be a computer equipped with the requisite speech program for a blind person. It can be a telephone that a cell phone rather, that has is universally designed. For example, the iPhone, it has built-in features to accommodate blind and visually impaired individuals as well as deaf persons. So, you know, assistive devices, assistive technology is really any device, any equipment, any instrument that is used to improve the functionability of persons with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Floyd. I'm wondering if you could perhaps share a little bit, before I get to my other panelists, share a little bit about even your own experience using assistive technology. Because for our audience, you can tell our audience about your own.
Okay, all right. Well, you know, I'm a blind person. I was born in fully sighted, but developed a glaucoma at age 13 and got blind at age 20. And, you know, when I got blind, I never knew that I could function in society because of the way individuals view persons with disabilities. And so, you know, I was really depressed until I went to the Jamaica Society for the Blind and got rehabilitated, and then was introduced to a number of assistive technology, talking about a braille machine that assists a blind person to write and read, and then learn to use the curse while reading machine, which is a machine that reads for a person who is blind or visually impaired. Those were the main assistive technology that was available. And of course, the white cane, because the white cane is a form of assistive technology. And you're talking about in the early 1990s. And those assisted me in terms of my functionability until you know, I went to the University of the West Indies, and the technology kept on improving to the point where we are now fully exposed to a wide compendium of assistive technology. You're talking about the iPad that I use, that gives me unlimited access to social media, whether it be Twitter, whether it be Facebook, whether it be WhatsApp, Instagram. I am able to interact with different audiences through those platforms on my iPad. And then there is my laptop that I use with a JAWS software, and that enables me to do all of the research that I have managed to do over the years, and to assist me in terms of my teaching endeavors, because I'm a senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies as well.
Excellent.
So it's a whole lot of issues in my parliamentary work. I have to do a lot of research, a lot of reading where the laws are concerned. And it is the assistive technology that I have that has enabled me to do all of that, you know. And so for me, assistive technology is quintessential for a person with a disability to function effectively in any society.
All right, thank you so much. That was quite informative and interesting. I'm going to turn over to our other panelists now. Professor Paul Golding, you'd like to share your perspective on the question, what are assistive technologies? Thank you.
I think Floyd, my newest friend, has done quite well.
That doesn't mean that you're very young either, Charles.
Go ahead.
I think he has been very comprehensive with the definition of what assistive technologies are, because they're both technical and non-technical. And he mentioned the whole gamut of it. And what is interesting is that Floyd can speak from experience, because this is the life that he lives. My association with persons with disability is primarily via the Jamaica Association for the Deaf. So my input is going to be primarily from a deaf perspective. I had gone to a deaf conference in the Middle East, and I was told about then the Assistive Technology Industry Association, which they have their meetings in January in Florida every year. And whenever you go to that conference, it is kind of a conference and a trade show in which there is this wide variety of assistive technologies. One of the things that we went, and this is maybe about 5 years ago, in which we interacted with this it's both software and hardware, in which we really had a conversation going with this hardware software, and I don't know why I'm missing the word that I'm looking for here.
It's okay.
In which we introduced ourselves the first day, and when we were passing the second day, it said, "Well, go on, man." and of course we were taken aback, because we were saying that this device is not supposed to be interacting with us that way. what I can say is, since I've been in the industry, in this space, the technology has increased leaps and bounds. And what you have found is that technologies that may have been targeted to the disabled community has enabled persons from the non-disabled community. I, for instance, I do not type anything in Google if I can talk to Google. I find it a waste of time to be typing when I can ask Google to do something and it just goes ahead and do it. And that is one of the ways, for instance, speech in which persons who are blind are able to speak to the device, and it does what you need it to do. I think Floyd does the same thing. Yeah. So the technology has really increased leaps and bounds. And what it has, what these assistive technologies have done is to really enable people with disability who would normally not have been able to do things that able-bodied persons take for granted. For instance, my deaf students, if there were not cell phones, they would not be able to communicate with each other after school. Because there's no way to communicate on a regular phone. So they can use video and sign themselves, or they can type. Without that, after school, there's nothing. There's no way to communicate with another deaf person or one of their students other than using the technology.
Thank you so much for that answer. I'm going to turn it over to our other panelists because we have a few more questions and we want to get to them, and it's already 25 minutes after 6 and we don't want to keep people long here. So I'm going to ask, Ayodele, I'm going to leave you for last, but I'm going to ask now Jeff Hall. Ayodele, don't feel bad. Mr. Jeff Hall, can you respond to that question? What are assistive technologies? So thank you again, Professor Golden and Dr. Floyd Morris.
Yeah, I don't think I can, it's hard to add to what both of the professors said. It was a very comprehensive sort of definition of what assistive technologies encompass. And I particularly like Dr. Golding's point about how assistive technology is really kind of moving more into sort of non-disabled spaces. So where technology may be designed for a disabled person, but we're seeing more and more use by non-disabled people, such as like speech to text software, and it's really becoming sort of more mainstream. And I think it's maybe helping
universal design.
Yes, universal design, absolutely, and it's really helping more. Excuse me, more the sort of the reach of the understanding of the benefits of it, I think.
Thank you so much. Ayodele, would you like to share anything, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
All right. So the other panelists did a good job of defining assistive technology, so I wouldn't attempt to do that. From my perspective and in my experience, I'm particularly concerned with how do we build technologies and that are accessible to people with or without disabilities. And maybe later on in the conversation, I can talk about some of those experiences because I've had a long career in this field, especially as it relates to web content and accessibility. And so it suffice to say that from my perspective, this whole concept of accessibility falls under user experience. And while we probably think more about people with disability, or what some people call differently abled, we expand in that definition to also user experience for also situational or temporary disabilities. And so there's a wide range of scenarios where accessibility design comes into play.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over now to our host, Mrs. Fiona. And everyone should know that that's Dr. Floyd Henry's best friend.
The phrasing we used was that he was my oldest friend, and we want to make it just like that, right? Floyd, I think I'm going to just rearrange how we've asked the second question, because we go on to define, the World Health Organization sees assistive technology as an umbrella term that covers services and systems that enhance people's lives and well-being. Thinking of students with disabilities and universal design, what are some of the examples of these assistive technologies that we use or can use in schools, or beyond my K-12 context into universities and so on? And how can they remove barriers to accessible and inclusive education? So how do we achieve on the promise of education with or through assistive technologies? And shall we start? How do we start? Go ahead, Floyd. I see you. I see you're ready to answer.
Okay. Interestingly, I just completed 2 articles that has been accepted for publication by one journal in the Caribbean, and the other for Palgrave Macmillan book series. And the issue of digital assistive technology has been the core of those articles. And one of the things that we have to understand is that there's just a wide gamut of assistive technologies that are available to different types of disabilities now. So you would find that the deaf persons who are visual creatures, meaning that they rely on their sight for functionability, they have their hearing aids, they have their cell phone, and they use that for a lot of texting and communication with individuals, because their main issue is a communication issue. Then you have individuals who have physical disabilities, and the issue of wheelchairs, the issue of I would say prosthesis, dependent on the nature of the disability, the physical disability. And then you have a software called Dragon Naturally Speaking, which allows for individuals who are quadriplegic, for example, to communicate using the computer, which converts speech into text without the individual having to touch the keyboard. And in the context of a person who is blind, you have the JAWS software, you have NVDA, non-visual desktop application, which is a cheaper version of JAWS, but it doesn't give you the full service as a JAWS software. And you have all manner of universally designed cell phones now that allows for blind and deaf, as I had indicated, to function. All of these equipment, all of these technologies enhances an individual's capacity to perform in the educational space in a fairly efficacious manner. I mean, students are now able to use the technology to interact with their lecturers, interact with their peers. Gone are the days, for example, when you would have a group meeting and exclude a deaf person because, you have Zoom that has been around for some time, but has been brought to prominence due to the pandemic. And Zoom has interpretation features on it to accommodate a deaf person. So a deaf person can be a part of the conversation. When during the pandemic, we use ORVLE at the University of the West Indies, and it has capacity to provide sign language support for deaf students as well. So the technology has evolved to facilitate an inclusive environment for persons with disabilities. And bear in mind that based on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, assistive technology is treated as a right of persons with disabilities because it is that means, it is that mechanism that is going to facilitate the access to information, the access to participate, and non-discrimination in society. So the assistive technology is really a game changer in the educational landscape for persons with disabilities. And I'm certain that at some point in time, the discussion will morph into the disparities and the contributing factors to lack of access for persons with disabilities, especially those who are in the developing countries.
Thanks for all of that. You made me think just now, and I know I'm going to move to Ayodele in 2 seconds to see what he'd like to add, and then to Jeff, because they sort of answered towards the end. But I can see, for example, like moving out of the pandemic and this sort of rush to get back to normal, to your last point, Floyd, that, we may forget that assistive technology is essential for some folks. So, now that us folks who are able-bodied don't need certain features again, how quick are we to dispose or, to move away as if this is not something that's important or critical for some people to function? So thanks for your response. Ayodele, would you like to add anything? And then maybe Jeff, or let's go back the other way.
All right, thanks. And so, no, absolutely. I think we all know, I think we've all accepted, especially coming out of the pandemic, and that the future of education is digital. And in some way, shape, or form, as we look to the future, we are thinking about ways to introduce more technology into education. And so from where I sit, I think it is very critical for us to consider as core to building of technology, developing these technologies to be able to be used by people with disabilities. I think sometimes it's these features are second thought, and they are not seen as important. But I think Dr. Morris would have alluded to the fact that, this can be viewed as an act of discrimination, and because access is one of the critical things when we think about inclusive education. And so there's so many different technologies, assistive technologies, but I think there's also an argument for design. For example, the way technology is designed. For example, we have, from a user experience perspective, for example, persons with physical disabilities, simply designing a button that is very important to the use of that technology. We've seen that a lot of these technologies, they have small buttons, and people with disabilities find it difficult to tap a button just because it's too small. And so even thinking about the way you design technology is absolutely very, 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 very important. And then we think about, I like the title of this particular session, because we said essential for some and good for all. Because as I alluded to earlier, we also have situational scenarios. And as we know, students are in a wide range of different situations or scenarios when they're trying to use technology, right? So for example, when I talk about situation or temporary scenarios, for example, if a student's arm is broken, right? All of a sudden their use of, or their behavior with technology changes. If you're in a library without headphones, but you still want to maybe use a video for study. If you're in a moving vehicle and maybe you're studying, and so temporarily you have some physical mobility or dexterity issue, or maybe your mouse stopped working. And so all of a sudden you need to use your keyboard to navigate technology, or maybe you're having slow internet issues and maybe the images are not loading and you need some alternative text. And so even though we're talking a lot about assistive technology, I think that can be expanded to design of technology to be inclusive for everyone. And as we said, it's essential for some, because whether there is some type of visual impairment, there's vision, so there's partially blind protanopia, deuteranopia, there's hearing disabilities, and so there's so many different aspects of disabilities, and I think that we need to consider all of them. And I would end by saying in that I believe in the Caribbean, where I am from, I think that we need to implement legislation to support and this move, and legislation similar to ADA, for example, in America, Americans with Disability Act, or even in Toronto or Ontario, I should say, we have AODA, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act, or something like that. I think we need stronger supports such as this to ensure that as we build technology for the future of education, that we always include and we always consider people with disabilities.
Jeff, maybe do you want to take a stab at this question? For all we have so much access, one could argue, in public education here. Is there anything that you'd like to add about how you see assistive technology and access here, what it means for inclusive education in the Canadian context?
Yeah, I think too, and maybe this is also it's definitely a Canadian context, but I think also an international one too, where the pandemic, we spoke about the pandemic, and it really sort of it made access an issue for everyone. Everyone during the pandemic got to experience a little bit of what disability was like in some form or another, whether it was access to work, whether it was access to school. So, and I think it's a really great point that there is a real risk to take away that access for those who still need it, particularly around schooling. There's a lot of discussions, whether it's in K-12 schooling or in post-secondary schooling, about, well, what is this access going to look like now? Are we going to do hybrid classes? Are we going to do online classes that are both asynchronous and synchronous? And it's at least it's forcing the conversation of what access looks like in education. And I mean, the pandemic was a high price to pay for that, I think. But at the very least, we're having that conversation now. And we need to be kind of vigilant that we are protecting those rights of disabled people who still need this type of access.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, it's funny because the next question asked, you know, at the height of the pandemic, there were numerous concerns about the hundreds of thousands of students. And so this is sort of, I think we've shifted into this. Hundreds of thousands of students who were isolated in school learning because of systemic discrimination and lack of access to the internet or to technology. As mentioned before, there was a deafening sort of silence. There was this huge silence around access for folks, access to education and assistive technologies for students with disabilities. So, you know, to Jeff's question, I don't know if, to Jeff's response, I don't know if Professor Golding would like to add. How are you finding things? And is there a risk? You know, we say essential for some, good for all. And what that means is that if we're likely to be creating things, particularly in a capitalist society, and you have a wide market, right? There's clearly going to be more profit in it. But if there's more profit in it, is there a risk that the folks for whom this is essential might get lost? What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts, if you'd like to add anything to that?
Sure. Let me just make sure that you guys can hear me, right?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay, good. It was mentioned earlier about user interface and how important user interface is. On the occasions when I've gone to the Assistive Technology Industry Association conference, what I had seen was several different types of interfaces that were being used, and a number of them we experimented with them. For instance, there was eye gaze in which and I think there's a lot of eye gaze software out there in which you can use your eyes as an interface to input data on the computer. There's also brain interfaces in which you, based on what your thoughts are, you can use that as an interface. And especially for the eye gaze, there were quadrupedic who use this. These technologies, though, tended to be multi-layered technologies, meaning that there are layers and layers of technologies being used. One, and two, they tended to be expensive. And especially for the developing countries, these types of technologies are not going to translate easily or be transferred easily from, let's say, a United States to a Jamaica or to the rest of the Caribbean. And there's always going to be demand and supply. And if there's not enough demand, the prices are not going to go down. They are going to remain expensive. So that is, and I don't want to go into this yet, that tends to be a barrier to accessibility. So there's a lot of things being done out there in this space, but because of the cost associated with it, it then creates greater accessibility problems. Now, as it relates to during COVID, I can generalize on this first, and I think this would have been common among countries, is that when COVID hit, it showed just how important technology was for us to continue to communicate. Zoom became a blessing, in which, as it was said, that Zoom was around for a while, but everybody now knows Zoom, because without that, there would be classes, but there would not be as many classes. And the accessibility issue also came up in the form of, and I'm generalizing here now, in terms of access to devices, access to broadband internet connection, because these were issues that both able and disabled persons had. The cost of access to broadband, especially if your only means was through a cell phone, and therefore you had to be buying data at very high cost in order to access whatever that was going on. So I think those are the two main things in terms of accessibility during the pandemic. One, the broadband availability, the cost of broadband, and access to devices, especially if it's one device in a home and there are several persons who need to use it. As it relates to deaf persons, I tell you what happened to us in the beginning, because we only had 2 deaf students, and there was, and when I say we, I'm talking here about University of Technology, Jamaica. The deaf students were just not accommodated at the beginning. The main deaf schools in Jamaica had to close. They were just not functional. So when other schools went online, they were not able to go online because of the communication issue, mainly, and then secondarily access issues. I think no, especially for the group of students that I tend to teach, again, these are able-bodied persons. They are of the view that if classes go back to being fully face-to-face, a number of them will not be able to continue because they now could access from wherever else in Jamaica. They could be attending a class. They could be located in Montego Bay and attending a class in Kingston, and they were fine. And they didn't have to deal with the transportation issue. And there are other things that came up. How do you deal with babies crying in the background and all those other things, which comes up as a result of doing remote learning. I think I've said enough.
This is a really interesting topic, and I'm happy that we're having this conversation. We talk about how the pandemic exacerbated a lot of the structural or the systemic inequities that we have, this is so for people with visible and invisible disabilities. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Annette. I'm well aware that we're sort of moving in time very quickly, and we want to make sure that we're giving you each of you a chance to respond to the questions. Annette?
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much, panelists, for such an engaging conversation around this important topic. I want us to go a little bit further on the same idea around access in terms of inequity. And so one of my questions here is then, how do individual ideologies and biases contribute to systemic structural barriers which create inequities against people with disabilities? And when we talk about disability, we're talking about visible or invisible. And then, so because of the interest of time, just to look at how some of the intersecting forms of social identities, including race, gender, class, impact access to assistive technology. I'm not sure who'd like to go next. I think I see Jeff smiling. Jeff?
Like you can't wait to get in there. Go for it, Jeff.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Oh no, I probably should have stifled my smile there. Yeah, this is just both of these questions, the intersectionality, but also sort of that structural barrier, I think, are probably the most important questions when it comes to assistive tech or any topics really around disability. Education, whether it's K-12, I think primarily in K-12, but also in post-secondary, education has a lot to say about disability without sometimes saying really anything at all. Education likes to regulate disability. We like to, as educators, speak to and about disabled students, but never with disabled students. So I think those are some of the structural pieces. But I also think that when we bring things like race, class, and gender into the mix, especially in, in Ontario, for example, in predominantly white educational spaces, where a lot of the students might be Black, Indigenous, or racialized, but a lot of the teachers and the administrators are white. What ends up happening is access sometimes becomes an issue where ability gets questioned. And when that gets intersected with racism, with sexism, and misogyny, I think particularly, again, in those white educational spaces, a lot of assumptions are made about disabled students, especially disabled students who might be Black, Indigenous, and racialized. So when, for example, an access question about someone who might need a screen reader to read a particular text, if they're also a Black student, if they're also maybe a female student, the assumptions might be made that the ability for that student to read, that student just simply doesn't have that ability. And so access to that technology might be hindered because of both the racism and the ableism involved in the judgments that some people, I think, are making. So access becomes much more fraught, I think, when other forms of oppression are just really put into the mix. And again, I just need to reiterate that in these spaces, education has a lot to say often about disability without really ever engaging with disability. So.
Thank you so much. I think who would like to jump in with that answer?
Floyd Morris here. Floyd Morris here.
Okay.
I just want to pick up on the point that my colleague just made about ableism, because it is at the core of the problems bedeviling the educational space and assistive technologies where persons with disabilities are concerned, because the entire educational architecture throughout the world is designed for individuals who are construed as normal, without taking into consideration the needs of individuals with differences. So for example, the schools are built without the requisite access features. Teachers are trained in teacher training colleges without any mention of students with disabilities. And in the classroom, right there, the blackboards that are there are all designed for individuals who are able-bodied. And thankfully, there is now a push now for inclusive education. And in inclusive education, there is the understanding that with the use of assistive technology, persons with disabilities can in fact participate in the educational space on an equal basis with others. But what we are seeing is a significant gap in that new ideology of inclusive education, because whereas developed countries have moved along the continuum to get persons with disabilities included in the mainstream classroom, with the use of technology and training for teachers and so forth, developing countries are lagging behind. And that is because of the significant gap that exists in terms of assistive technology. The latest global report on assistive technology that was published by the World Health Organization and UNICEF 2022 states that developed countries, persons with disabilities in developed countries, 85% of those individuals have access to some form of assistive technology. Whereas in developing countries, the number of persons with disabilities who access assistive technology range from 3 to 10%. 3 to 10%.
Wow.
So look at that gap. 85% in developed countries, 3 to 10% in developing countries. And you can understand the reasons why 85% of the population of persons with disabilities living in developing countries are living in abject poverty.
Oh my goodness.
I want to add something to this, that I want to bring another measure into this, which is race. I know Floyd didn't mention anything about if the access to assistive technologies is in these developing countries, if they did it on based on race at all, because what we have seen is that even in these developing countries, persons who are not Anglo-Saxon, white Anglo-Saxon, tend to be more marginalized than those who are Anglo-Saxon. And women tend to also be more marginalized. However, when you look at this in an aggregate form, it will show you higher levels. But if you break it down based on race, it will show that education was never really designed for anybody else but usually white Anglo-Saxon male. That's how it all started. It didn't even include women. And it certainly didn't include anybody who wasn't white Anglo-Saxon. And still the education that is given out to other persons is different. Within the country, developed countries is different from what you see happening for the majority of persons in any of these countries. And you see this, I mean, when COVID came around, it was embarrassing how these divisions were started. However, there's no further discussion on this because that is the way it is supposed to be. So when it came up, it was embarrassing, and then we move on because it's not something that we like to talk about, and it's not something that we're going to do anything about anyway. So we have just gone back to business as usual. So what I understand the whole issue of assistive technologies to in developing versus developed countries and the stark differential. And what you find happening in a lot of these developed countries is that these devices are supplemented by the government so that you tend to be able to have access to them in these countries. Countries with smaller budgets and having difficulty being able to look at just basic items for the general population, what you find happening is that persons with disabilities, especially the invisible ones, tend to get even more marginalized than others. That's my 2 cents.
Professor Golden, if I could just interject there and move into our last questions,
Yes.
question in the interest of time. And I think Ayodele had alluded to this initially around the need for policy change and policy shift, particularly in the Jamaican context, in the developing country context, and bearing in mind conversations around intersectionalities, particularly around race and class. What policies and resources then, speaking more specifically around what you would like to see implemented, do we need to have implemented, particularly in Jamaica, in the context in which we're specifically speaking to, but also thinking about Canada as well, and similar jurisdiction with similar issues. So what do we need to see in terms of specific example to improve students with disabilities access to assistive technology? And I'll start with Ayodele and then ask anyone else who would like to pick up the conversation.
Okay, sure. So as you said, I alluded to it earlier. I think our policymakers need to look at the environment and that we are creating for people with disabilities. And we talked about access. There's also the notion of engagement and how are we able to really drive, teaching and learning outcomes with people with disabilities. And remember, we also look at the intersecting forms of social identities we talked about in the previous question. We have race, we have class. We talked about gender as well. And I think Professor Golding also alluded to geographical location, where we're from, as it relates to the economic issues that are related to providing access to assistive technology. He also alluded to the digital divide that exists. And I think if we look at the pandemic, if you consider it a 2-year experiment, right? And there's a lot of empirical evidence that that shows that the people that suffer the most are the people in a specific class, those people who are from a specific location in terms of countries, and also the people who are disabled. I can't quote the numbers offhand, but one of the things I did as a CEO is that I read a lot during the pandemic about how different people are being affected, and the numbers are startling. And so, first of all, there's legislation. I think there has to be passionate and strong legislation that is motivated to create an environment that supports people with disabilities, but also people from less fortunate backgrounds, and also, and we haven't spoken about it, but also people with cognitive disabilities as well. Providing solutions and education to target those people. Sometimes it feels like we have come to accept that some people will fall through the cracks, and we allow nature to take its course. But I think we have to provide resources. I think that there's not enough money being spent on education. When you look at our budgets across the region, upwards of 70 to 80% of education budgets are spent on salaries. And then maybe another 5% is spent on resources and so forth. There's no resources, there's no money, there's no investment to move the needle forward as it relates to driving access and engagement in education. So these are some of the things that I would like to see in our region.
Yeah, and before another panelist picks it up, I do want to pepper the conversation by saying that I know the government in the Jamaican Ministry of Education is thinking more purposely about these things, and have recently this year published their ICT in technology policy. But as you mentioned, there still needs to be more concerns or more discussion about what that resource allocation would look like. So we don't also want to paint it as a deficit model that the Jamaican government or the ministry isn't thinking about these things, But as you rightly say, there needs to be conversation about resources. Okay, so I'll open it up to the other panelists.
Just point out that, countries within the Caribbean are moving towards the enactment of legislation to protect the rights of persons with disabilities, and included in that is the issue of assistive technologies. And certainly this year, in February of this year, the Disabilities Act of Jamaica was brought into effect, and there is going to be codes of practice relating to the legislation that speaks to the issue of assistive technologies for persons with disabilities. But, one of the things that has to happen, because 90% of the population of persons with disabilities in the Caribbean are unemployed, and they are unable to purchase these assistive technologies. They are expensive. A JAWS software, for example, costs about $1,400 US, and you have to purchase a laptop to add to that, which takes you over 2,000 US, and the average person with a disability don't have that sort of money to purchase the software. Eh? An hearing aid is superly expensive. It costs well over $300,000 for a good hearing aid. That is Jamaican dollars, right? And a way has to be found to make sure that these individuals can gain access to these assistive technologies at a cheaper price or for free. There is universal service funds that have been established right across the Caribbean as a result of the liberalization of the telecommunications industry. And these funds should be used as a means of providing at least a one-off assistance to persons with disabilities in terms of accessing the technology. And the final thing I want to say, I'm going to Saudi Arabia next week at the invitation of the Saudi government. They are having their disability studies conference, the King Salman Center for Disability Studies. And it's very instructive that I am going to be presenting a paper there on modern assistive technologies and the inclusion of persons with disabilities in society. And one of the things that I have put in my paper is a call for global action in terms of directing assistive technology support for persons with disabilities in the global south. And I am going to be making an appeal to those multi-billionaires, the Jeff Bezos and the Bill Gates and so forth, to dedicate some of those funds that I have read and seen that they say they will be giving away a significant portion of their wealth. I believe that the cause of persons with disabilities is a worthy cause, recognizing the data that I have highlighted in terms of the disparity between the global north and the global south. And I believe that it would be a worthy cause if they pool those resources together, whether it be financial or through the specific assistive technologies to provide the support for persons with disabilities in the global south, especially those who are using education as a means for social transformation. So I believe that, we can approach the thing in a particular way, and with advocacy, we can see some changes.
Okay, I
I
know
can go
we had
to Saudi
promised-
Arabia.
One second, Fiona. I know we had promised the panelists that we would have kept it within an hour. So I do want, I'm looking at the faces, I do want to provide opportunity for Jeff and Professor Golin to speak, and beg for another 5 minutes in case the audience has any questions.
If anybody wants to say they want to go to Saudi Arabia.
Well, first I have to say that I hate going after Dr. Boris, because I want to listen to him the whole time. But I think, just to add to what everyone's been saying, yeah, I think especially in the Ontario context too, I think we're facing some similarities where we have some laws on the books, but none that have significant weight behind them. We don't really have, although some organizations like the AODA Alliance are trying to push through accessibility standards through the provincial government that will hopefully make access somewhat easier. I think the discussion of disability and poverty is something that we just scraped to the surface of, but that really needs to be addressed. And finally, the only other thing I would kind of add to this is, I think alongside, and this is more of a general conversation about disability with assistive tech, but in disability in general, alongside access, I would also love to have the discussion around disabled joy, around the sort of the disabled brilliance that we see in so many of our students, and that disabled people and disabled students in particular are not just people to be fixed.
Right.
And I would like to sort of see that conversation happen in schools too, alongside the conversations of access.
Absolutely.
Professor Golin, you have the floor to take us out.
Okay, just to say something quickly on concentrating on deaf students. We, at the University of Technology, this year we graduated 2 deaf students, 2 profoundly deaf students. So we're not talking about persons who required hearing aids, but we required interpreters in order to get them through. It took a little longer, but we learned along the way. The students learned along the way. And not just the students who graduated, the deaf students, but other students, because they were in an inclusive environment, which is one of the things that I'd like to see, far more inclusivity, and I know this doesn't happen so much in Canada, but in Jamaica, what you tend to have is that you have schools specifically for deaf students. Sorry, and I'd really like us to move away from that. The other aspect of it that we have not touched on is the training for teachers to deal with persons with disabilities, which is also a crucial part. And I'll just make mention of an example here. We have in Jamaica instances of where teachers teaching deaf students cannot do sign language. And if you have teachers who can't do sign language and there is no intermediate, no interpreters, it means that you're not really giving access. The students are going to school, but they're not getting access to education. So you need to go further than just, what I'm saying here is that assistive technology is not a panacea. It certainly helps a lot, but it needs to go beyond that and not just be looking at assistive technology alone. That's my closing remark.
Okay, thank you very much for those wonderful and insightful remarks. I'm wondering if there are any burning issue. I know we're well past the 1 hour that we advertise, wink, wink. Burning issues from the audience, 2 or 3. I am not seeing any come to me. I don't know if there are any sent to you, Jerome.
Or if there are no questions, any comments that you'd like to make?
Enjoyed listening to the doctor. I think he's got a huge insight of you know, the topic at hand.
Derek, I think you're perhaps saying something, but we can't hear you. You're not so clear.
Okay, sorry about that. I said that I enjoyed listening to the doctor because he has a huge insight into this topic again. So this whole thing has been quite informative.
Thank you so much.
And for me, here in Canada, yes, sometimes kids do fall through the cracks with you know, small disabilities. And it's up to the parents to kind of you know, basically speak on behalf of those kids to not being pushed aside. And for us, you know, we were told our daughter should not take university classes because she wouldn't be successful. And now she's got 2 degrees under her belt and doing her master's in mental health in the University of Toronto.
Amazing.
And as a social worker, basically for a racialized minority. Studies.
Thank you so much for that comment, Derek. We appreciate you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else would like to share a comment before we go?
Yes, I would like to make a comment. I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion, and it's good to hear that others have ideas or are generating conversations on what is needed for those individuals who fall in those categories of, you know, even marginalized persons. So this was a great conversation. I really appreciated that I was able to listen in on those variations in topics and conversations for those who are even unable to access these resources themselves. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone. I have a few friends on here. I think she's from Haiti. A professor, you'd like to make any comments before we close out? If not, we're going to end. Thank you so much.
I just got a message from Maureen Henry, who is my dearest friend, who stated, what about the government of Jamaica giving access to persons with disability? I suspect she means access to the library for free. Wondering if there are services that people with disabilities in Jamaica have access to for free. I don't know if in terms of public services, I don't know if you can speak to that, Dr. Morris or Professor Golin, real quickly, and then we'll close.
Well, access to the library services are not, individuals are not charged to access library services. And I know that there was an attempt, certainly through initiatives that I had worked on with the Jamaica Library Service to get some assistive technologies in the different parish libraries for persons with different types of disabilities, whether it be physical or the use of JAWS. And those are still there because they are not used with any regularity. The issue being access to the physical plant. So it's not just the access to the technology, but access to the physical plant. But with the new Disabilities Act and the Building Act, which is the sister legislation to the Disabilities Act, we're supposed to see some changes in the physical infrastructure. And that is going to take time because those are new legislation that is going to be implemented over time. So, you know, I am anticipating that within the next 5 years, we're going to see a significantly transformed Jamaica in terms of access to physical infrastructure, access to technology, because of the current legislation that is just being rolled out. It's early days, but over time, you know, through progressive realization, we'll see the changes.
All right, thank you very much for that response. And considering the time, particularly the panelist time, and I see Jeff is laughing.
Yes,
Welcome to Jamaican time.
I have to run, leave you.
No, I love it. I love it. I love it.
Okay, we would like to thank our panelists who took the extra time to be with us today. The viewing members on YouTube, but particularly our members on Zoom, as well as Jerome, who's in the background providing tech support. This is a very important topic, and we wish to ventilate it, you know, in much more details as Professor Golin and Jeff and others have identified that there are so many other aspects that we need to focus on, such as disability joy, as well as training for people who are providing services for people with disabilities. But as we continue the conversation, please be sure to join us on our social media platform, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future.
We'll ask our panelists to just remain for 2 minutes. Dr. Floyd Henry, I know you said that you have to go, but just give us 2 minutes, okay?
It's actually Floyd Morris. I don't think he's married to both me and Colin.